Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now today I'm honoured to be speaking with Forensic Psychologist, Professor Laurence Alison. Laurence, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Hi Dan, how are you?
I'm really well, thank you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Really excited to talk to you about your new book. But before we get started, people will have heard there that you're not a sports psychologist or a sports scientist or a sports coach. You're a forensic psychologist. And we're going to be using your book today to talk about rapport and relate that to coaching. Before we get started, why don't you give us a potted biography with regard to yourself?
Sure, thank you Dan. As you say, I'm not a sports psychologist. I don't have much interest in sport other than a bit of boxing. I'm kind of interested in boxing. But other than that, not a big sports fan, I must confess. So if you're looking for wisdom around that, that's definitely not me. So what have I been doing? Well, for about a quarter of a century, I've been a forensic psychologist. My early career was looking actually weirdly at offender profiling. I did a lot of work on debunking offender profiling, so all the stuff around Silence of the Lambs and that kind of thing. And I gradually drifted into looking at police decision making and police information gathering. And this book has come out of sort of 20 years of research looking at how we communicate. And, your viewers will remember, I'm sure, because it's prescient. And in fact, we're recording on the 11th of September today, aren't we? So the 9/11 events and the huge controversies and appalling issues that were inflicted upon people under the auspices of supposedly enhanced interrogation tactics, but were actually really torture. And how desperate some of the US interrogators got using those techniques. And the long and the short of it is that there were a number of other eminent psychologists and indeed detectives and practitioners that recognised that those techniques not only were morally reprehensible, abusive and indeed illegal, but there actually was a much better way. And, to some members of the general public, counterintuitively, that better way was using rapport. Showing compassion, showing understanding, showing active listening, not forcing people to talk, and that's where you tend to get results. So the book comes on the back of a number of studies that were done on a very large field-based examination of interviews, police interviews, security interviews with terrorist suspects and detainees, and we found, unsurprisingly, that those techniques that were rapport-based worked. And since then, we've grown that into identifying exactly what rapport is, how it works, why it works, and in various different domains, whether that's with adults and children or within organisations or indeed, sports psychology and coaching. It's a fundamental process that is about how we relate to one another, how we get on one another, and how we understand one another.
Well, as you mentioned there, whilst you might not be a sports psychologist or even that interested in sport, rapport for coaches is so important. And I mean, before we get started, what I want to say to the Sports Psych Show audience, or the coaches out there listening in, as we talk today, have a think about your relationships with players. Consider the challenging conversations you're having with players, maybe with parents, with other coaches. If you're involved in a bigger sporting organisation, then think about the communications, the conversations you're having with staff across the organisation, in your department, outside of your department, because today we're really going to be honing in on what rapport is, how to develop rapport, how to have great conversations, how to have uncomfortable conversations with people that you might be coaching or that you're working with. The book, Laurence, is called Rapport, The 4 Ways to Read People. And I think a great starting point, you may have already briefly touched upon this, so please excuse me, but I think a great starting point is to define rapport. What is rapport to you? How do you define this in the book?
So it's a connection between two people who don't necessarily need to like one another and get on. And we've defined it as being comprised really of 2 bits. So when we lecture about this, we tend to break the lecture into 2 sections. Section 1, we talk about what we call the cornerstone foundations of rapport. We'll get into this, I'm sure, in a moment. But we talk about what we call the HERE principles, which are honesty, empathy, autonomy, and reflection. So that's the kind of atmosphere or value system that you need to take into an interaction if you want to, develop, sustain, or strengthen relationships. If your intention is to grow a relationship or deepen it or strengthen it, then those are the things that you need to take into those interactions. So that's the kind of value system, if you like. And then beyond that is how you manage these different types of dyadic interactions. And again, I'm sure we'll get into the weeds of this as well, but we talk about power, and we talk about these two fundamental processes in any dynamic interaction. Who's in charge and who's leading? It's the power dimension. And are we fighting or are we cooperating, which is the communion or love dimension, as it were, which gives us kind of four quadrants, which we call control, cooperate, capitulate, and conflict. And in any given interaction, we might be arguing, we might be in a follower leadership relationship, or we might be in a cooperative team relationship. And, I'd imagine as a coach, there are going to be times where you're going to disagree with the person that you're coaching. That would be conflict. There are going to be times when you're asking your student or person that you're training to follow you, which is the controlling bit. There are going to be times when you're going to be working together, which is the cooperating bit. There are going to be times when you're going to be needing to listen to the person that you are coaching. So, like I say, the value system that you bring into it is important, irrespective of whether you're in conflict or you're in a follower leadership relationship or in a team relationship. That's here. And then thinking carefully about how you navigate those difficult processes of control, cooperate, capitulate, and conflict.
Well, as you mentioned, we're going to really dig down on those four core foundations of rapport, and then we're going to be talking about the animals that you relate to the different types of communication, which is a fantastic system or process of helping people understand the way to build rapport. To start with, I love the way you open the book. And I'll give you my perception of the first couple of chapters, because what I learned in essence in chapter 1 is, in many respects, rapport is a skill, and I think people don't necessarily appreciate this, and maybe this is quite true in the world of coaching, is that coaches perceive some other coaches as really good at building rapport. Hey, that person over there is really good at the soft skills. They get along so well with players, but what I love about the way you open the book is that it feels what you're saying to the audience is meaningful relationships can be established. Rapport is a skill. Rapport leads to meaningful relationships, but this is a skill. And you've told us there about essentially what we're going to be talking about, these systems that you've created to help people develop that skill. But you also say that words matter. Words matter because the way to get on with people isn't through trickery or deception, isn't through bullying. Words matter. Have I got the correct feel for the way you've started the book there?
Yeah, absolutely. And the sort of red button that you pushed in my mind there is when people describe rapport as soft skills, which irritates me. It sounds like it's a kind of tree-hugging, granola-eating, softly approach. And, some of the best interrogators that we've seen are real hard asses, Yeah. And if you want a rapport-based, if you think about the relationship that you have with your teenagers or your wife or, whoever it is that you love, sometimes you're going to have pretty tough conversations, and it isn't always about being touchy-feely and nice and lovey-dovey. We're going to argue. We're going to have tough times. Things are going to get brutal. And, soft skills, I think, decries the importance of, look, at the end of the day, we're in lockdown at the moment, aren't we? Or have been for a long time. And there seems to be an increasing kind of binarism of thought about everything. You're either a leaner or you're a leaver, or you support Black Lives Matter or you don't. Or there's all these huge controversies to wear a mask, don't wear a mask. Are you a Republican, Democrat, Tory, Labour, etc., etc. This increasing division between us all. And yet, if we want to be a bit more kind to one another, it's about seeking understanding. Why does this person think this way? I might not agree with it, but I've got to try and make a bit of effort to be curious about what's going on here and accept that there's going to be disagreements. But those disagreements need to be managed carefully, and that isn't through just constantly being nice. It's about seeking understanding. So rapport is, certainly when we lecture, we have to do a big section on what rapport is not. And it is not about being nice. Some of the people that we teach have to deal with people that are literally sat across the other side of the table that want to kill them, that have a completely different mindset, that have a totally diametrically opposed viewpoint. But the way of getting information out of them, the way of getting rapport with them, isn't to like them. You don't have to condone or appreciate or like what they've done. but you do have to seek to understand it. So that's a bad buzzword for me. This is about, as you say, but you're right, it is about developing skills, working on things, and appreciating the difference between instructing and advising and bullying and coercing. They're not the same thing. So each of these things need to be managed accordingly and proportionately and wisely.
The word that hit my mind as you were speaking there was negotiation. You used the word understanding. It almost feels that a couple of overarching words, understanding, negotiation, perhaps co-creation. But I love that word negotiation. I'm often saying to coaches, we're going to get on to the power piece today. But I wonder sometimes when we're in a position, whether we perceive ourselves in a position of authority, or we're trying to get something out of a relationship, that we require the ability to understand and then negotiate.
Mm-hmm.
What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I suppose if I throw your question back to you, if you're guiding a team as a coach, how often do you experience the sense of, God, why is this person not performing today? And how often is the temptation to just kind of want to make them perform in the way that you want them to perform? I mean, as a coach, as a kind of person that's in charge, I mean, we see this in schools, don't we? And certainly, I mean, maybe this is why I was put off sport to some extent, or at least team sports as a kid.
Yeah.
It's a very machismo kind of thing. And, I'm actually quite a physical person now. I like kayaking. I like hiking, kayaking. I like getting out running, stuff like that. But I was really put off sport at school because it was very machismo. It was very autocratic. It was very didactic. It was assumed that if you're a rugby player, you had to be this type of person, or a football player, you had to be this type of person. There was no listening or understanding or seeking behaviour from certainly my sports teachers about what would help me get into those sports. Just no interest really. And I think maybe I could have got into them more if there'd been a bit more listening and a bit less presumption of us all having to be exactly the same. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that, Dan? As a coach, as a sports trainer, how often do you see people where, or at least coaches where you think, God, why isn't this person reaching out to this young kid a bit more and trying to figure out what's going on instead of just imposing their own structure on how they should think the kid should be performing?
I think what you're talking about is one of the biggest challenges in our industry. It's the participative piece. So what you're saying there, how can we engage young people to be involved in our sports when what we bring to a table is an idea or a set viewpoint of how that person should behave or who that person should be? So it's relevant from a participative perspective, and that was your experience and what put you off sport for life. And what you're saying there, possibly unbeknown to you, is a huge hot potato in your industry right now, because the data suggests that there's poor participation across the lifespan, which is leading to all kinds of health problems, but as a result of how we introduce sport to young people and how we continue to help them experience that sport. It matters from a performance piece as well, because if we are only as a coach or a head coach or a manager, as we might use in the UK, say in football, it matters from a performance perspective if the head coach is unable to negotiate with a player or understand a player's point of view, negotiate with a player, because modern society, whether you call it the millennial generation, Generation Z, they at the touch of a button have a lot of information in their hands. Having knowledge isn't necessarily enough these days for coaches, because a lot of young players have a lot of knowledge. It's about getting the best out of players. It's about understanding them. It's about negotiating. It's about understanding their viewpoint of the world and how they best feel that they function within the group, or how they can best go about how they play. would that ring true to you, especially from a school
Yeah,
perspective as well?
I mean, I guess I'm thinking of, when we've had breakthroughs in interrogations or interviews, they are the moments at which, the officers kind of, I mean, of course, one always needs to keep sight of the goals of the interview. So, if you're doing an interview, I mean, in the same way that I would imagine you are with coaching, quite literally, you want the goals, but in an interview, the goals are quite explicit. It's about evidence and information. So, of course, you can't lose sight of that. But where we see the breakthroughs, where we see people that have gone from no comment interviews or saying nothing to actually talking, is where the interviewer has shown a objective curiosity about the person that sat in front of them and a non-judgmental regard for them. That's not to say, like I say before, well, it's okay that you've gone and blown these people up, but it is a kind of, what is on here? Why has this person presented in this way? Why are they not talking? What's going on? And being professionally curious about it. And that's where you get the breakthrough. Once you start to understand someone's values or belief system, and actually all of this starts with active listening, doesn't it? If you are not interested in the person that is in front of you and you're not interested in what their drivers are, their values, their motives for engagement, then you're not going to get a lot further with them. That for me is the starting point. So I would imagine with coaching, it's not dissimilar from an interrogation insofar as I've got this person in front of me. How am I going to get the most out of them? Well, that is not by imagining that they're just a fact-giving machine that once you ask a question, they'll give a fact. But it's about, right, what is underpinning this? What is driving this? What are the levers that are pushing them forward? What are the things that are holding them back? And if I can't understand that, I can't motivate, I can't propel them forward.
What I hear you say there is, I may be in a position of power, but I can't change behaviour if I'm unable to understand, or if the person in front of me doesn't believe that I understand or believes that I don't care. If I'm not expressing empathy, then I'm unable to help that person change. In your world, I'm unable to get them to speak, to talk. In our world, I'm unable to get them to even consider changing their motor skills, or working a little bit harder or a little bit more effectively on their skills or on their tactical acquisition or whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or even redirecting them in a positive way. If you have a kid come to you that's had a pretty appalling, grim life and has got a sort of degree of aggression and physicality that they want to get out, as a coach, you want to redirect that in the appropriate direction. But you've got to, and some of the people that we've been involved in interviewing or supporting have pretty appalling lives, difficult lives. But that doesn't mean they're not intelligent. It doesn't mean they're not wanting to do the right thing. It's just that they haven't been listened to, they haven't been supported, they haven't been understood, and they haven't been cared about. And that takes a bit. That's a big hurdle to overcome. I've seen that that have never had a single grain of positive reinforcement in their life, and when you give them a bit of positive reinforcement, it's like a light's just switched on and something's changed overnight. They've never had it before. We've had 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15-year-olds that have never had a kind word said to them. A little bit of reinforcement goes a long way, as you know.
It's really interesting that, and I'm keen to dig down on the approaches and the techniques you talk about in the book, so we'll do that in a second. But one last thing, what I heard you say is that it's not that people aren't keen to do the right thing or to change. They want to be effective, they want to succeed, they want to help, they want to be involved. However, whether it's through personality, whether it's through experience, whether it's through the thoughts and feelings that have grown in them as a consequence of their experiences, the strategies they use, the way they go about things, might not be in line with what the organisation needs or what's best for them, essentially. But the only way, or the most effective way to help them to change, is to yourself in line with them, to understand them, to communicate with them in a manner that helps them to open up, that helps them to have a discussion about the circumstances that they're in.
Yeah, that's right. And, I think the first base. Well, I mean, as with Shackleton or any of these great leaders, is pick your team, understand your team, understand the drivers that support the team, and then you can move forward. So I do think the first, maybe we should get into this now, but, talking about these power dimensions, in my book, you're not allowed to lead until you've had a go at following. And that is, and that even entails when you're in an actual strategically or powerful role. If you want people to work for you, the first thing you have to do is listen. You have to actually take up a back seat. You have to let the other people that are in your team talk first so that you can understand what you've got in front of you. And, we've seen that with many leaders, haven't we, where they've never been in a position of having to listen. And that is to their detriment. Understanding who you've got in your team is critical. And you can't do that unless you're an active listener, unless you're prepared to sort of go to sort of at least base one with empathy and have an honest discussion about what the drivers are.
Well, you've used that honesty there, and I'd like to have a conversation around your 4 core foundations of rapport, and you've got an acronym here.
Mm-hmm.
Honesty, empathy, autonomy, reflection. You've mentioned them previously. But let's dig a little bit deeper into each one. So honesty. Yep. Take us through honesty. I mean, how's that a part of building rapport?
Well, it's about having an authentic relationship with the person that's in front of you. So what we talk about is putting a bit of a tightrope with honesty, where you don't want to kind of do trout in the face honesty where you're so blunt as to be borderline insulting. But if you see a problem, you've got to call it out. And people have got a BS radar. If you're constantly sort of nice to people and they know that they're not performing well, then there's a kind of inauthenticity to that. And again, I always go back to the interrogation context because that's the world I know. Yeah. We sometimes get suspects that will ask a direct question of the interview, and if they don't get some kind of authentic answer back, and the interrogator is just seeking to please them, that BS radar goes off very quickly, and that suspect knows, well, this isn't a person that I can trust. There's an inauthenticity to it. Yet when they're authentic, even if they disagree, now we've got a bit of a connection. So honesty to me is, it's a core foundation of rapport building, where you need to have a degree of diplomacy in the way that you say what it is that you think. And one doesn't need to be mean, but you do need to mean what you say. You don't need to be mean in the way you say it. So that's the kind of simple nutshell version of honesty. Be direct, be forthright, be clear, strip out the kind of emotional language from it. Appreciate that the other person might not agree, but be honest. If the performance is poor, you need to call it out. If you disagree with someone, you need to call it out. You're not saying you're right, but you need to land the honesty principle right at the very outset of a relationship so that we're clear on what the parameters are. You
mentioned right at the beginning of that we want to be honest, we want to be straightforward, be clear. We don't want to be too blunt. What do you mean by that? What could too blunt look like?
Well, I mean, maybe we should take a coaching example. I mean, can you think of an occasion where someone's been so directly brutal to put someone off for life? I mean, maybe throw a context at me or give me a difficult scenario where, say you're coaching someone, they're performing poorly. What goes through your mind that you want to say, but that you feel that you can't, or have seen it, or maybe frame it another way. Have you ever seen a coach someone and say something far too complimentary about something which was actually a bit poor, and you thought, God, why are they being so nice when actually it's clearly not the right way to do it?
The way I'll answer that is I think there's a real tension around honesty when it comes to helping players develop skill, develop technique, if you like, that a coach might perceive a player to be deficient in a certain area, but be concerned that if they're honest, that player might drop in confidence, or they might damage the relationship they've got with the player as a consequence of being honest. And that's where there's a real tension. I'll tell you my thoughts on that. I think it's important for coaches to be honest, but I think this is an example where framing the deficiency in a skill, framing the conversation is really, really important. Advising a player that whilst there's many areas that they're really, really, really good at, there's a couple of areas that I've seen that I think you can improve. And I feel I've got some ideas that can help you. That to me would be a useful way of helping a player understand what they need to get better at. But there's a real fear from coaches in terms of how they actually communicate honestly with players around things that they perceive that they need to get better at.
Mm-hmm. So then maybe we should take an example. Say you were coaching me and I was a young football player, and I was presenting as super keen, and I wanted to get onto this great team, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And I did have some skills, but for the last 3 training sessions, I haven't turned up. And I'm saying to you, look, I'm one of the top guys you've got in your team, and you want to say to me, well, look, Laurence, not being funny, but you're not showing me your motivation because you haven't been here for the last 3 occasions. I mean, hey, talk me through how you'd handle that. Don't want to put you on the spot, Dan, but that example of I'm super keen, I think I'm great, you do think I'm great, but I'm still not showing the motivation that you would want as a coach because I've missed the last 3 training sessions. How would you negotiate that conversation with me as a 15-year-old lad that's on your team that hasn't showed for 3 occasions? So what I'm saying is, in your mind, you're thinking, this kid's pretty good, he still needs some support, I want him on the team, he's my best player, but for 3 occasions he hasn't turned up. What is going on here? I need to have an honest conversation saying, basically, you haven't turned up for the last 3 occasions. So I turn up on occasion 4. Hi, Dan, how's it going?
I love the way you're a real psychologist, Laurence, turning back on me. It's brilliant. I would affirm what that player is good at. I wouldn't disagree with that player, but I would help that player recognise that by turning up to every session, he or she would give themselves a better opportunity to improve even more. I would lay out how excited I would be about their potential and what better looks like.
I'm just thinking, though, do you not think, honestly, I mean, if it were me, if this kid hadn't turned up for 3 sessions, what would honestly be in my mind was, God, you're a bit of a smart arse. You think you can just avoid these 3 sessions? I need to have a word with you. That I think would be honestly in my mind, and I would want to kind of have that conversation. So, it needs to be broached. It needs to be avoided, and you need to not reinforce the fact that this kid's not turned up 3 times. So that is a difficult potential conversation to have. You don't want to lose the kid. So, I'm just playing this conversation through in my mind. If the kid turned up and said, "Hi, Dan, yeah, I'm ready to go," I don't think I would start with, a lot of affirmation about how great it was. I'd maybe be on a bit more of a fact-finding information.
Yes.
I'd say, Laurence, I noticed you haven't turned up to the last 3 sessions. And just pause, see what's said. Mm-hmm. Now, this could go all kinds of ways now, couldn't it? The kid could say, yeah, I've been busy with my mates the last 3 weeks, right? Which, again, as a coach might make you think, oh, really? That's interesting, yeah? And again, you need to, I think, take that head on. So if the kid says, I don't really need to be here, these other kids in the team, I can kick their butts. I'm a much better player. I don't think I really need to turn up to all the sessions, do I? So we're starting to go down that route, and that's going to need to be carefully explored and negotiated. So I just think for me, the first phase of this has got to be about listening. But at some point, there's going to have to be a conversation about this potential motivation. And already, in that example that I've just given there, one of the problems or deficiencies with this player is their presumed superiority over the rest of the team, which could then be a problem at some point later. And that's going to need to be taken head on, and a serious, proper conversation is going to need to be had about it.
What I'm thinking there is, if I open with, I've noticed you haven't turned up for the last 3 sessions, or I've noticed that you've been late for the last 3 sessions, whatever that scenario might be. That question, that open question, potentially gives the player an opportunity to explain his or her situation. So that player might say, yeah, no, look, things have been really, really busy right now. I just, coach, it's just been a nightmare to get here. Which I think potentially leads neatly onto the empathy piece, because that affords you the opportunity as a coach to say, oh, you're saying to me life's been really busy. Mm-hmm. Do you want to tell me a little bit more about that? Empathy is important after honesty.
Yeah, exactly. So, as I say, it could go a number of different ways. Or even if that kid says to you, yeah, well, I don't really need to play because I'm such a great player. There might even be something under that's the problem. So you're absolutely right. It's about listening. It's about reflecting back what you've heard. It is about the empathy piece. But let's imagine we've gone through all that and we have identified that actually this kid just thinks they're too damn good. Then we're going to need to have a serious conversation about what that looks like. And that I still think can gently be supported. That can be a thing that can be worked on. And as that player grows, they will recognise it in supporting the team. You can call out the good things, the affirmations, and as Steve Rolnick says, picking the flowers. Laurence, you're a fantastic player. Your team needs you, and they need you at each session because you're one of the inspirations to the rest of the team. I can't have it that you're not going to turn up for 3 weeks. That is going to make it difficult for your fellow players. You're right. You've got the skills. You've got you've got all the skills that you need. But one of the things that I'm telling you as a coach, you're going to need to work on is your motivation to be here for your fellow players. And there's a kind of honesty to that isn't mean, that is direct, and can be a consultative, negotiated process. Now, if that person comes back to you and says, well, I'm not really interested in the team, you might want to explore that a bit more. But at some point, that is going to become a sticking point or problem for the team. Whereas it might be the person says, yeah, maybe I do need to accept that, and they might grow from it. So I don't know. It's maybe not the best example, but I think it is an example of how, as a coach, your overriding instinct is to say, where the hell have you been for the last 3 weeks, without fully understanding what the reasons for that absence are, whether they're legitimate, and as you say, we could take us down the empathy route of understanding why the person's not been there because they've got problems, or they actually have a attitude problem or a deficiency in appreciating the importance of the team, and that then is what needs to be worked on.
No, I actually think it's a great example, and I'm just thinking about your 3 tips essentially for honesty. Avoid using deceit or trickery. I think coaches could be embroiled in deceit and trickery. We use the term deceit and trickery. I'm kind of thinking from a coaching perspective, well, if you turn up, you'll definitely play, which may or may not be true. You've talked about keeping calm. I think in that situation, as you mentioned there, you might get angry and you might say, well, why the hell are you not turning up? This is disgraceful. This is awful. And emotion is clouding your ability to empathise, right? Is clouding your ability to actually get to the bottom of why this player hasn't turned up, because there might be some legitimate reasons why this player hasn't turned up. And then be clear, objective and direct. As you're saying, just be very direct. As you mentioned in the book, words matter, be very direct. I've noticed you haven't turned up for the last 3 sessions. I've noticed you've been late the last 3 sessions. Can you tell me about that? So there's no ambiguity there.
Yeah, and also no judgment. Exactly as you've said there, you've been very clear, very direct, complete non-judgmental. You're open to and alive to the possibility that there might be a perfectly good reason, even though everything in your brain might be screaming, that's been a complete pain for me and for the rest of the team. But if you're just saying what you see without judgment or emotion and inviting a response and then listening to the response and then exploring it, then we can move ahead. But what you do tend to see people do is think, God, this is really annoying me. Where have you been? And as soon as you leak that, you're going to get defensiveness. You're going to get what's called reactance. A reaction to the assumption that you haven't turned up because you're lazy, you think you're better, da-da-da-da-da-da. It's about being open. It's about being objective. It's about being professionally curious. It's about saying what you see, but being prepared to be completely open as to what those reasons may be for that absence.
From there, the potential for empathy. Empathy being a listening statement, thinking about my interview with Steve Rolnick back in episode 68, empathy is a listening statement. We're not necessarily compassionate. Compassion might be different from empathy. Here we might not necessarily agree with the person's position or stance, but we empathise. Coming back to that notion of, I would always use the term, I insist, you resist. So we just want to gather information here. Now, what's interesting, so in here, the A is autonomy, and very, very common within coaching. I mean, almost the very centrality of coaching is this righting reflex. It's to say, well, you need to be doing it this way. This is what we need here. And and rather than the A for autonomy, helping that player in front of them, providing choice, helping them come up with their own solution. Am I along the right tracks there, Laurence?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you mentioned Steve and Steve's work in this area, and Steve's been a great inspiration to us, specifically around the development of the HERE principles, which, as you rightly said, are based on his work and Bill Miller's work on motivational interviewing, providing personal choice. And what you really don't want to do is actually back someone into a corner or try and rationally persuade someone. You might actually be creating a problem that wasn't there in the first place. So someone might actually be quite keen, and as soon as you say, well, why haven't you turned up? It shows you're not keen. You actually elicit the response that you don't even want. So this objectivity and professional curiosity about what's going on, important, providing lots of choice and not wanting to cause reactance is absolutely key. And I think the other thing, just to go back to the empathy principle as well, is, again, people often confuse empathy with the kind of warm, touchy-feeling response, but actually proper clinical empathy is quite cold, quite clinical, quite Mr. Spockish. It is kind of, what is going on here? Why is this person thinking this? And again, we say to our interrogators, if someone's behaving seemingly badly, don't think, God, this person's being a bit difficult. Think, why is this person being a bit difficult? And be curious about it. So, proper, what we call level 3 empathy. We talk about these kind of 3 levels of empathy. Level 1 is understanding why you do what you do and how you feel. Level 2 is sort of thinking, well, I've seen someone else behave this way, and if I was in their shoes, I would maybe think like that if I was in their position. But proper level 3 empathy is thinking, well, I'm not them, but perhaps as that person, they might be feeling this particular way. So if they're a 15-year-old, I'm not a 15-year-old anymore, and I've probably forgotten what it feels like to be a 15-year-old. But if you are making the effort to imagine what a 15-year-old's world is like in their particular context, then you're making that effort to go to that point of empathy. So yeah, honesty, having honest conversation, not skirting the point, getting to the point neutrally. And I mean, the other thing on that is, sorry, I'm going all over the place here. We often talk about what are called TED type questions, which are good. So instead of saying, which is exactly what you did, we gave you the scenario, which was, I noticed that you've been absent for the last 3 weeks. Can you tell me a bit about that? So TED questions are tell me, explain, or describe. Can you explain that to me? Can you describe, rather than a closed question like, why weren't you here? Or you haven't been here, have you, for the last 3 weeks? Which elicits a no. Label what it is that you see and invite explanation through these kind of TED questions. Can you tell me a bit more about that? Can you explain that a bit more to me? Can you describe? They're always good, leaving lots of space for the answer, and then reflecting back what you've heard, using the empathy principles to try and seek further understanding and put yourself in that position. And then the autonomy choice, giving them the choice. As soon as you try to hem them in, box them in, trying to elicit what you want, it goes the other way. So yeah, these are 3 key principles.
When you say providing choice, so the autonomy piece, providing choice, do you mean literally suggesting options for how somebody could behave?
Yeah, or at least not constraining it. So if you were to say, well, look, if you don't turn up next week, I'm not playing you. Quite often that will elicit, okay, well, we're done. So as soon as you constrain the options, you actually might be eliciting a response that you wouldn't have otherwise got if you didn't give that kind of brinkmanship position. And I would imagine in coaching, brinkmanship's quite a big thing. I've got this power, and if you don't behave in this way, I'm going to withdraw. I'm going to withdraw that, and you can't do that. People don't respond to brinkmanship. They might in the short term, but in the long term, it starts to breed resentment, and they'll be looking for somewhere else to go. So that kind of brinkmanship thing is not good. You want to explore choices, and you want to give options, and where you can't always give complete autonomy. And parent-child relationships, you have a responsibility to children to help guide and be in charge of their behaviour. But if and when you can provide choice, you should.
The two words that come to mind there are authoritarian and authoritative. That this process involves being authoritative, certainly not authoritarian. And that being authoritative can involve providing options and allowing the person in front of you to make their decision around those options, or even come up with their own plan of attack.
Absolutely. Yeah, 100%. Even better if you have the ability as a coach to enable them to come up with their own suggestions, which they've bought into, even better. Yeah, 100%.
The is for reflection, and in the book you talk about detecting values and beliefs, and I really love this. Can you tell me a little bit about that? How does one detect values and beliefs, and what do you mean by that within this kind of conversation?
Yeah, so we touched on this at the beginning, didn't we? That it's important to know what people's drivers, motives, values, beliefs, and thoughts are. And, that's often very well accessed through these reflection tactics. And it's not a simple parroting back of what the person said. It is a seeking. We often talk about what someone says is the tip of the iceberg. The actual words that they have said are what's poking beneath the surface. But underlying that, you don't know what the size of the object is underneath. So reflection techniques are to help you access and explore a little bit further what those underlying motives are. Maybe if I provide an example. Say you were a personal trainer and I was coming to your gym and I said something like, God, I'm really finding it's difficult to find time to work out. I appreciate that I need to lose a few pounds, but man, my job is so busy. I'm really struggling. Well, so there's a number of things that you'd want to explore about that statement, and you'd probably want to explore as a personal trainer, presumably, those things that were positive about the statement. So what you would be seeking to reflect back are the things that are within the statement that are positive. So I said in that statement, I know I need to lose a few pounds. So that might be one of the things that you'd want to latch onto as a reflection. Now, what we talk about is a reflection tactic called developing discrepancies. So sometimes people will hold competing beliefs that seem inconsistent. I know that I need to work out. I know I need to lose a few pounds, but you know what? I haven't got the time. So a good developing discrepancy statement would be to say something like, look, I appreciate you haven't got the time to work out, but I recognise that you're saying to me that you value your health. That's all you need to say. And then the person will continue. So that's what we call a double-sided reflection. That on the one hand, you're saying you haven't got the time, but you are saying that you recognise the need to work on your health. And the reason you want to reflect it that way round, i.e. put the front end of the statement about the time and the tail end of the statement about the fact that the person's recognise the need to do something about their health, is where they will take off from. If you reflect it the way round, so what I hear you saying is you recognise the need to look after yourself, but you're saying you haven't got the time. What I'll take off from there is, yeah, exactly, my job is hell. I can't ever find the time. Whereas if you end on but you said you recognise your health, that is what I'll take off from. So you've got to be strategic and tactical in the way you reflect, and you're looking for those bits in the statement that are going to take you in the direction that you want to be. So let's think of another example. Let's go back to our young kid that turns up at the football training. I'm enjoying my football, but I don't feel I need to train that much. I've got all the skills, but I don't really think I need to come to these training sessions. Well, you probably don't want to reflect back the bit about I want to come to the training sessions. What you want to reflect back is that the kid's got the skills. So you would say, tell me a bit more about what you're feeling about how skilled you are. Yeah, well, I can beat all these other kids, and I scored the last 3 goals, etc., etc., etc. And that can take us on an affirmation journey, which is about supporting the kid and recognizing that they're doing good stuff, which might then take us to the point where we can broach the subject of some of the other team attitudes, if that makes sense. So reflection can be a very useful tool to start uncovering what meaning lies behind each of these individual statements.
You're looking for opportunities to expand the conversation, to reflect back what the person values, what their belief is, and then explore further there.
Yeah, and get under that iceberg, see what it is that we're dealing with that sits under the iceberg. So say the kid came back and said, I haven't been to the last training sessions, I'm sorry about that, but I don't feel I've got the need to. Yeah. Depending on what you say next. So you could say, you said you feel you don't need to. And that will take us down one line. But you could just be very functional with it and say, you haven't turned up for the last training sessions. Tell me a bit more about that. Well, I've been having a bit of a rough time recently. I'm a bit worried about my mum. Your mum? Yeah, she's been having problems with dad. Tell me a bit more about that. So this mix of TED-type questioning, listening, providing a lot of space, and reflecting back strategically those areas that you feel as a coach you don't understand fully yet what is going on here. You might have made an assumption about it, but let's explore that a bit. Let's test it. Is this kid not turning up because they think they're all... Actually, maybe there's something else going on here that I need to explore a bit. And that's about listening. That really is about listening.
Moving on here, uncomfortable conversations. I'm just going to read a little bit from the... You say in the chapter, Power, Intimacy and the Animal Circle. And we're going to start exploring the animal circle. You say, everyone has an interpersonal comfort zone. It can be very difficult to move out of this and manage interactions you find more difficult. It's very tempting to simply try to avoid social situations you find awkward. And so that neatly takes you on in the book and will neatly hopefully take us on to talk about the animal circle, which is a system, and please excuse me if that's the wrong word to use, but a system that you've created that can help navigate people through difficult conversations. Do you want to tell us a little bit about, again, you spoke briefly about it earlier, but I want to dive a bit deeper into T-Rex, mouse, lion and monkey. Tell us a little bit about where the animal circle came from, and we can go from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. So, this goes back to work in the 1950s. So, like Timothy Leary, that was looking at personality research, and his view was not to decry or diminish the research that was going on into this idea of static or stable traits like openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The big 5 factors, but to recognise that actually that only partly explained personality. And his view was that actually you also needed to explore personality by looking at how people behaved in the presence of other people. So let's call it interpersonal theory, yeah? And his argument was that there were 2 fundamental dimensions of personality, or 2 motivations that underpinned how people dealt with other people. We talked about the power dimension and the communion dimension. So let's talk about those. So if your listeners can visualize a kind of vertical line in their head, where at the top you've got power and at the bottom you've got submission. So this is the power dimension. And in any interaction, you tend to get one person leading and one person following. Now that might change through an interaction, but at any point in the conversation, so as we're talking here, I'm in a power dimension and you're listening, but that might change in it. So, and the idea is that the higher you go up the power dimension, the more you exert higher power, the more you are inviting a submissive position from the other person. Yeah? So that's power. So that's how that axis is supposed to work. On the horizontal axis, so if let's take this vertical axis now, let's draw a horizontal axis through it. So we've now got a cross shape. And on this dimension, we've got what we call communion, which is how close or intimate we want to be with others. So on the right-hand side of that, you've got cooperation, which is about being a team, working together, doing stuff together, being social, warm and friendly. And on the other side of it, you've got conflict, which is about arguing and disagreeing and so on. And unlike the power dimension, where the higher you go up power, the more you're inviting lower, on this dimension, the more loving signals that I'm sending out, the more I'm hoping to get those loving signals back. The more aggressive conflict-driven signals that I'm throwing out, the more likely I'm to receive those back. So this dimension works slightly differently. And as a shorthand, we just decided, because we do a lot of training for police officers, some cops, some people that we train as a shorthand like to talk about these visual totemic animals. So basically, lion is the control dimension. That's being in the power position. Monkey is about cooperating and working together. Mouse is about listening and taking a backseat and being more stiff. And the T-Rex is about arguing. Now, Leary's argument and ours is that any one of these four archetypes can be done well or badly. So can you lead effectively and be in charge and advising and setting the agenda? That's good line, yes. But if you take it too far, you crank it up too much, that starts to become demanding, dogmatic, pedantic and rigid. Equally, if we look at Mouse, yes, it's good to follow. It's good to be a humble, listening person that is prepared to listen, seek advice and so on. But you don't want to crank the handle too much that you start to become uncertain, weak and avoidant. Monkey, yes, great to be a social, warm and friendly person, but not too inappropriately friendly and too fawning and a bit obsequious and a bit desperate. And finally, T-Rex, which everyone imagines that you shouldn't ever be in conflict, but the reality of life is that sometimes we have to be. And it's okay to be a good T-Rex, which is being frank and forthright and clear, but not being attacking, punitive and sarcastic. Second is, at any one stage, we might have to lead other people, we might have to follow other people, we might have to work together, and we might have to argue. So in our lives, sometimes we've got to be T-Rex, sometimes we've got to be Mouse, sometimes we've got to be Lion, and sometimes we've got to be Monkey. But it's how we navigate those processes that matter. And interestingly, from the perspective of a coach, depending on who you've got in front of you, might dictate that you need to be somewhat versatile in how you manage people. So in the book, and sometimes when we train, we talk about, say you were dealing with someone like Gordon Ramsay, yeah? You were having to coach Gordon Ramsay. Well, what type of animal is Gordon Ramsay? He's no mouse, is it? So if you were in the wrong position in dealing with Gordon Ramsay, you've got a bit of a problem. So if you want to coach someone like Gordon Ramsay, you probably have to adopt a slightly mouse-like position. You're dealing with Gordon Ramsay. Gordon Ramsay comes in through your door. He's going to be on your football team. Are you going to be a sort of strong line with Ramsay? Well, you're not, because if you are, you're going to butt heads. The first port of call would be to listen, to sit back a bit, be a bit more submissive, but not weak and uncertain. So he's comfortable. So a dominant person is comfortable with you being lower. But the danger is that you go low and weak. And actually being the strong mouse, you can still be persistent, you can still be a listener, you can still adopt a back seat, but that doesn't make you uncertain or weak. So you need to adjust to the person that you've got in front of you and not go too far into the kind of weak mouse or indeed strong line. So again, as a coach, you might have some people that you're dealing with that are quite quiet and more submissive. And that would give you the authority to be in the lion position, but not to the point where you're being too dogmatic and too assertive. So we talk about these wheels as being proportionate in our response to dealing with the sorts of interactions that we've got in front of us at any one time.
When might a coach adopt a mouse position? For me, coaches are very socialized into thinking that they need to be the lion. Otherwise, I'm going to lose my authority. I'm going to lose my ability to lead these players.
Yeah.
When might a coach adopt a mouse position, and how might they do that?
Yeah. Well, we have exactly the same thing with police and military. When I talk about the joy of the feeling of surrender, that doesn't go down with military personnel. So no, we never saw what's the point of that. And also cops, they want to be in control. But actually, the ability to sit back and think and take your time and let this person either let off steam or let them feel in a controlling position can be a massive breakthrough point in understanding how to coach them. We get exactly the same thing in police interviews. I can tell you all our elite interrogators have absolutely mastered this humility of the mouse. if you as a leader are still prepared to learn, even from, someone that you might not like or you might not respect or is very dominant, but you're prepared to sit back and just for a minute listen. It doesn't mean you need to stay at that position, but that ability to think, this is quite interesting. What am I dealing with here? I maybe need to listen to this person. And you know what? I might even be able to learn something from them. There's a kind of strength in that position of capitulation and listening and proper active listening and consideration. So it's, I think that role of adopting a quieter position sometimes can be a real strength. And we've seen that in some of the best interrogators that are very experienced. Tend to find is it are less experienced interrogators that have done less of this, do want to be in control, do want to be in charge, and at all times. And that's the difference. Your strong leaders, your strong interviewers, your strong decision makers, they can lead when they need, but they can also follow and listen when they need to listen. And I think that's the difference.
The elite player storms into the coach's office and starts ranting and raving about how it's unfair. I should be playing. You didn't play me last Saturday. It's disgraceful.
Yeah.
And at the very top level of, let's say, a sport I'm heavily involved with, football, soccer, that player could be valued at 80 million on the transfer market, for instance. And one of the challenges that coaches at that, or managers at that level, have to navigate is the fact that, the owners probably want you to deal with this player quite carefully because they're worth a lot of money.
Yeah.
And the tension there for that manager, for that head coach, is, well, I have to assert my authority. But what I hear you say, Laurence, and what you outline in the book, the mouse is humble and not weak. And maybe in that circumstance, to find solution and eventually to co-create solution, you as a coach have to understand you have to take time to understand that thoughts and feelings and values.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a great example. So say that person comes in front of the team and displays that behaviour. So my first question, maybe, invite the listeners to think about this. So a person comes into the room and in front of your whole team, why the hell haven't you played me last week? This is outrageous. I'm your best player, blah, 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 blah. Now, first of all, the question one is, what animal behaviours are they displaying? Well, they're displaying lion, because they're being demanding, dogmatic. So that's, I'm in charge, you'll listen to me, blah, 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 yeah? And they're also displaying T-Rex, bad T-Rex, attacking, punitive and sarcastic. So the weird sort of animal creature hybrid that you've got here is a T-Rex lion, right? They want to fight and they want to control. So let's deal with the lion bit first. So again, listeners, think about what strategy you should adopt. If you've got someone that's being a bad lion, they're being demanding, dogmatic and rigid, what animal position should you adopt? Now, when we ask cops this, they will say they want to adopt good lion, but that's the wrong answer. Why is it the wrong answer? Because that person wants to be in control. So the right answer is, and we've evidenced this time and time again in all the interactions that we ever looked at, good mouse, humble, patient, persistent, because they're happy with you being lower, but being lower is a personal choice that you've made. You're still in control of your behaviour. It's not you being bullied. It's you choosing to adopt an appropriate level of submission to listen. So the way you deal with the lion bit is to slow it down, sit back and listen. But you've also got this slightly difficult problem of them being attacking, punitive and sarcastic, which is conflict. Now, to deal with conflict, you've got to take it head on, yeah? So you also adopt a T-Rex position. If someone's being attacking, punitive and sarcastic, you adopt a T-Rex position. But the good T-Rex position, do you attack back? No. Are you sarcastic back? No. Are you punitive back? No. But what are you? Frank, forthright. Yeah? You've got to be very frank and forthright and deal with this head on. So the difference between lion and T-Rex is, lion is I will tell you what to do. T-Rex is you will tell me what to do. And there's a distinction there. So how do you deal with someone that is a lion T-Rex? Well, you have to be mouse T-Rex. So for the power bit, you have to go lower, but for the conflict bit, you have to take on conflict. So my argument would be, in dealing with this person, is you say, I'm not going to have this discussion here. We're going to go to my office and we're going to talk about this. So you straight away grab them out of the situation. You don't take the attack head on or start abusing them back or ranting, and you kind of become quite controlled around it. And then you let them let off steam, and then you listen. And that is a weird position to be, because you've got a lion T-Rex, you've got someone that's high on power that wants you lower, you've got someone that wants a fight. So you've got to take that fight head on, take any, BS from them, but you have to be prepared to listen. And this is all about controlling your own and regulating your own emotions, because the natural reaction is either to feel bullied by them, so you capitulate and kind of crumble because of the harsh line stuff that you're getting, or to get aggressive and attack back, and neither of those are productive. But you do want to go lower, and you do want to take the conflict head on. So that position's not easy, but that is the right position to be.
You sound frustrated right now. Tell me more about that situation.
Exactly. And then all the reflection techniques come back in. Yeah, exactly. I'm frustrated because you didn't play me last week. La, 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 la. Well, that's okay. Let's talk about that. Let's explore that a bit and uncover it a bit. So, I've seen that kind of crumbling before or biting back before, and neither of those strategies work. You can't control the other person, but you can control yourself. And I think that's the point. That's the difference.
The me is about warmth, it's conversation, it's consideration. Mm-hmm. It's being a teammate. I think from a coaching perspective, there must be boundaries there that must be met. Would you say that Monkey has a formal and an informal element to it?
Yeah, absolutely. And with the animal positions, you can go too far. All of the animal positions, the good adaptive animal positions, are all proportionate. The bad, anything in excess is bad. So bad lion in excess is bad because it goes from being in charge to being dogmatic. Bad mouse is bad in that it goes from being humble to being pathetic. Bad T-Rex is bad because it goes from being frank and forthright to being attacking and punitive. And bad monkey can be bad because you start to blur the boundaries between appropriate, in a coach's example, is just given their appropriate warmth and friendliness to being best mates down the pub and always seeing the same person at the same time, or being too close, too intimate, and that presents its own problems in its own way. So, yeah, all of these about, being consistently, without being paranoid or excessive about it, thinking about, is this the right level of behaviour for this occasion? And I think, what we do see, some successful people start to become grotesques of their own personality. They get reinforced for being a very strong lion. Then they start to go from being what was a good lion into a bad, because they've got reinforced for that controlling behaviour. And the same with monkey. I've seen it before where we get good interviewers that are very, very social, warm and friendly, and that's to their strength and their skill, but they keep getting reinforced for that behaviour, and then they start to cross the line. They go too far, and what was a virtue starts to become a vice. So it's all about proportionality and moderation, I think. Each of the styles can be used well, and each of them can be too excessive and problematic. It's about striking that balance and getting it right, using the right thing at the right time and in moderation and proportionately.
It strikes me that your capacity to find the right style, the right animal, if you like, in any given situation, firstly requires reasonable knowledge of self. Would you say self-awareness is an important player in all of this?
100%, yeah, 100%. I mean, in fact, in the book, we've got a little quiz that people can take that will give them a kind of rough and ready assessment of what their sort of normal go-to style is. And, we ask people to look at their so-called maladaptive and adaptive wheel. And the first thing is, as with it, again, going back to our interrogators, what we're doing when we're doing training is not necessarily arming them with a new skill, but stopping them doing something they've learned to do, which is bad. So if you have any elements of bad T-Rex or bad lion or bad monkey or bad mouse, stop doing them before you start progressing on to doing the good stuff. We've seen this time, whether Stuart Rolnick will tell you exactly the same in training clinical practitioners. Often what you see are aberrant or bad behaviours that are examples of being a bit too controlling or a bit too weak or a bit too friendly or a bit too argumentative. And it's that you need to stop first, those excesses that we all have them. I mean, I research this, I teach this, and I know sometimes with my 16-year-old kid, I can be a bit sarcastic or a bit attacking. It's a style that we all have, and that's a forgivable thing, but it's something that needs to be worked on. So phase one, tip one is, as you said, absolutely be self-aware about the strengths and weaknesses that you have, and try and work on the weaknesses first. That's the important thing, particularly if you have any attributes of bad T-Rex. Where possible, you want to try and avoid conflict. It's not always possible, but where possible, you should. So we always advise that that's where people start with. If they've got some attributes of bad T-Rex, where they're quick to anger, that's the first thing you need to work on. Thereafter, start working on the listening stuff of the mouse, the humility stuff and being prepared to listen and being professionally curious. Then maybe progress to the kind of monkey stuff, working as a team. And then only after you've gone through that set of phases do you have, in my view, the legitimacy to lead people. Once you've removed as far as is possible those aggressive elements that some of us have, then you've adopted this ability to listen and understand and be professionally curious. Then you start to move towards this approach of being a team player. Then you have the authority to lead because you've been through the other phases. That's how we see it.
Well, I think you've partly preempted my next and final question. One of the later chapters that you almost closed the book on actually is improving rapport building, and you say that broadly interpersonal research has identified three key components to building expertise in rapport. Number one is competence, which you spoke quite a bit on there, removing any of the traits on the maladaptive, as in bad animal circle, from repertoire. So that's the self-awareness piece, and accepting that you're a human being. You're going to have a bad animal at some times. It's just recognizing that, isn't it, Laurence? Number two is sensitivity. The ability to correctly diagnose the other person's style of communicating, what sort of animal you are dealing with, and I suppose that's the listening piece that you mentioned there. And then number three is versatility, the ability to use any of the behaviours on the adaptive, as in the circle, as and when required. So that versatility, flexibility, adaptiveness, which I just think is so important in whether it's relationships or your own capacity to self-regulate, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, we've done lots of studies of elite interrogators, and those are the three attributes, and they are, they're demanding attributes. This is not easy to remove any bad behaviours from your repertoire of interpersonal relating. But as you say, you give yourself for screwing up, but at least recognise where you screwed up and what you can seek to do to remediate it. And then just working on some of the skills that you might be somewhat deficient in. I mean, Emily and I have written the book. My wife and I wrote the book together. And, we had arguments about the book. So at various points we had to sort of T-Rex one another. She's very good at doing the sort of monkey lion stuff. She can be in charge, but she's a very warm person. I'm very good at dealing with the T-Rex lion-y stuff. She used to be very bad at complaining about things, but because she's worked on those skills, she's improved. And equally, I've historically, quite being very introvert, found it quite difficult to sort of be warm and friendly. But again, you work on those skills. There are always things to work on. There are things to learn from. And as you say, quite rightly, that honesty piece, looking at yourself for a time in the mirror, sort of thinking, what have I got that I'm strong on? And what have I got that are some weaknesses? And just being prepared to sort of have the humility to I guess.
What I love about this book, Laurence, is it provides a framework or a structure for something that people don't necessarily think the framework or structure for, or don't necessarily know exists, essentially. I'm passionate in my own work about helping competitors, players in sport have a framework to their capacity to create a competitive mental framework, as I might call it. This can provide anybody with a framework for interpersonal skills, for communication, but it's so relevant for coaches because so much of coaching communication, in fact, you could say coaching is communication. And I just think that framework is not a question here, Laurence, but I just think that framework is so important. And I suppose maybe there is a question here. I think historically, what I've found is that coaches might say, "Oh, you're reading too much into this," or this is too hard, or it's too difficult, or why do I need to have a framework for my communication? I just need to know the X's and the O's. I mean, how might you respond to that? You must get some pushback from interrogators. Well, it's just about me going in there and, kind of what we said, taking control, or being, naturally linguistically good, or some people aren't. That's just, the way it is. Just a final thought on that, on the kind of pushbacks you might get.
Yeah, well, I mean, to be fair, it's surprising how little pushback we do get.
Fair enough.
Well, no, but to answer your question, of course we do get pushback. What I've got to say is that you tend to find that the better people are much more receptive to even being taught stuff that they already know, and there's no huge surprise in this book. If I asked anyone to think of someone that they've worked for, that they've respected, that they felt loyal to, there's no huge surprises in that when you ask them, were they honest with you? Yes. Did they show me empathy? Yes. Did they provide me personal choice to carve out the way I wanted to be? Yes. Did they seek through reflection how they, better understood me? Yes. Were they able to deal with arguments with me when we disagreed in a proportionate and fair way? Yes. Were they able to lead and advise me and set the and help teach me? Yes. Were they prepared to sit back and listen when I needed to be heard? Yes. Were they social, warm and friendly? Yes, they were. So, there are no huge surprises. And in fact, the model and our research all comes from very detailed observations of real interrogations with real detainees. So there's no huge surprises. But I guess what is weird, and I've noticed this myself, I'll quite often be sitting in the car thinking, God, why did I screw that up so badly with my son, with my students? And it's because I've fallen off the bad wheel. I've gone onto the bad wheel, or I've been dishonest in a way, or tried not to upset someone by, they're all things that I have failed on personally in an egregious way sometimes. But I guess the thing is, it does help if you have a structure to hang it on, a form of words that you recognise, and God, my wife will say this to me, she'll say, bad T-Rex, and just instantly I know that I've gone to the wrong place here. So I think it is useful having a structure which accurately represents but simplifies these hugely complex things that we're going through every day when we're talking to one another, to show you and help guide you as to fall off and where you need to get back on. I think that's the benefit of it, is that you're only really providing an organising framework around which you can help better understand and provide feedback to yourself and to others as to where you or they are going wrong, in order to seek improvement and, basically skilling up in these things. As a lecturer, I've got to handle difficult and sometimes problematic or upsetting student problems. As a trainer, I've got to do that. We're all in this position. We're all learning. We're all growing, and having a framework or a structure to hang it on, I think, is helpful.
Fascinating stuff. I completely agree. And, you shared a moment of vulnerability in saying, well, sometimes I get wrong, and you've written a book, and I definitely get it wrong. And as I say, I can only but reflect back what I alluded to earlier and what you've reinforced, which is having that framework can really, really help. And I know it'd be so useful for coaches. It's a fantastic book, Laurence. It is so important for coaches. How can they get hold of a copy? It's called Rapport, the 4 ways to read people. How can people get hold of a copy of the book?
Yeah, it's on Amazon and it's available through Penguin. It's a Penguin published book. Yeah.
Perfect. And I know you will have tapped the interest of a lot of sports coaches out there. So how can they follow you? Are you on Twitter? If so, what's your handle?
I'm on Twitter and I'm at LCritical, uppercase L, uppercase C.
L critical. Okay, surprised if you get a whole raft of sports coaches following you in the next week. Laurence, thank you so much for your time. It's just such a great book, and this has been such an interesting conversation. I've learned a lot. I've realised how much better I have to be at not just building rapport, but also having conversations with coaches about how they can help build their rapport with players. So thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, no problem, Dan. And yeah, thank you and for doing a great. And perhaps next time we talk about boxing.
We should do. We should do. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
I'm a big fan myself. But look, thank you so much. We'll get you on again. And I know you're in the process of writing another book, so we'll get you that. But thanks for your time, Laurence.
Great stuff. You take care, Dan. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast. Absolutely fascinating, and I'd love to know what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams. Tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show, and if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. Well, I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.